Hi everyone, good evening. Thank you all very much for your patience and welcome along everyone to the RHA tonight. My name is Chris Donoghue. I'm one of the presenters with News Talk Radio and I'm just going to be taking you through tonight, the next hour or so and the conversation we're going to have. If I can introduce the panel here beside me who we're going to be hearing from, first of all individually, but then in conversation and also with any questions from yourself as well. Nearest to me here is Mustafa Mustafa, who is the Executive Director of the Syrian Emergency Task Force. Next to Muaz is Barry Andrews, who's the Chief Executive of GOAL. Then next to Barry, we have Ambassador Stephen Rapp, who is the UN Ambassador at Large on the issue of war crimes. And next to Ambassador Rapp, we have Vicki Aiken, who is the Country Director for GOAL for Syria. So we're going to hear from all of our speakers in just a second. And I know from each person, I was watching some of you when you came into the room, particularly when there was no one else in the room, and my reaction was the same myself when I came in a little while back with having these images on the wall of a kind of sharp inhale of breath at the horror that is on the wall and the pain and suffering of men, women and children that surrounds us tonight, and a pain that shows on their faces beyond their deaths. And you can just, the word horror, it doesn't seem to go far enough. And this is a fraction of the 55,000 images from Caesar. And even the black labels up the top left-hand corner, the manner in which these bodies are catalogued, 3 different labeling systems, the word systemic and industrial, the scale of this is portrayed by that. And the images that you're looking at, just some of you may know more about Caesar than others, but the images you're looking at, they aren't a flash in the pan. This wasn't somebody who covertly went in for 1 day or even 2 days. This was a 2-year enterprise by somebody who worked for the state. Their job, they had seen horror. This was somebody who photographed death. But things changed, and we'll hear more about that from Muaz in a second. But this was a 2-year enterprise by Caesar to photograph this and to catalogue it with a few trusted accomplices or friends, whichever word you want to use. And I just think of the bravery of that, of imagine those of you driving home tonight having to be stopped at 4 military checkpoints on your way home, and the scariness of that alone, but also being stopped at those military checkpoints knowing that you had a USB stick hidden behind your belt buckle or hidden inside the sole of your shoe, and that you could be caught. The implication would certainly be death for you, but what about your family? How wide would they seek their revenge within your family, and also your friends' families who are helping you? So it's amazing bravery to have shown this image to the world, these images to the world. I often think about other people in other places and other horrors in the world who tried to do things like this, but because of a little mistake or because of bad luck, we never got to know their enterprise or their alias, because of course Caesar is an alias. So on that point, we'll talk more about that, but to expand more on Caesar and also the broader issue of Syria, first of all, I'll ask you to welcome Mustafa Mustafa. Muaz.
Thank you. And I want to thank everybody for coming here and taking time to come and view these horrific pictures. And I really want to thank GOAL for the opportunity to do this and for them putting this very important event here, because I think everyone must be aware of what's ongoing today as we sit here in Syrian prisons and intelligence branches across the country. You know, many of you may be very familiar with the conflict. You know, it started in such an innocent way in Syria. Children, inspired by what they saw in Tunisia and Egypt and these peaceful protests, were writing on the walls of a southern city in Syria called Dar'a. Some of the things that they saw: freedom, democracy, and so on. And these kids were taken, some tortured to death, and when their families came back to the governor of the province asking for accountability, they were told to go and make new ones. And as a result, the country erupted at first in protests calling for reform, but that quickly changed to protests calling for the downfall of a regime. And these were, by the dictator's own admission, non-violent, peaceful protesters that were, you know, bare chests were met with bullets and unlawful arrests, and you see around you what the end result of being arrested by the Assad regime is. You know, it was mentioned that the bravery of Caesar, which is really incredible, but it wasn't only he that feared that he would be stopped at any moment by any checkpoint. It was anybody, political or not. If you had the wrong name, if you were unlucky, if you came from the wrong province or neighborhood, anyone that stopped at any of these checkpoints in their regular commute from work to home could be stopped and could be arrested on the spot and end up in one of these intelligence branches. I want to give you just a quick background on Caesar himself. And this all starts in 2011, soon after the March 2011 incident in Daraa and the uprising that engulfed the whole country. Caesar was asked as his job, which was his routine, to go out and take pictures of any incidents that happened under the auspices of the Ministry of Defense. If there was a wreck or a car crash or a fire, he would go, he would take pictures for the sake of documentation and so on. And in 2011, he was asked to go out to Hospital 601 and to take pictures of accidents that ended up in the death of individuals. And when he did, he realized and he understood to himself that these are civilians that were tortured to death. And quickly afterwards, Caesar, again, a very humble man, someone that comes from the rural areas of Syria, someone who was very apolitical, goes home and tells a relative of his that what he had seen and that there's no way that he could be taking any sort of part of what's going on, and asks for help to escape the country. The relative contacts a group which makes up the Caesar team that I'm here to represent today, and to help him escape. And the reply was, of course, but would you be able to stay? You're in this very important position as a forensic government worker, photographer, to document what you see. And so bravely he agreed. And from 2011 until August of 2013, Caesar took photographs every single day, starting in 2011 where he was seeing 10 to 11 people, men, women, and children that were being tortured to death. And by 2012 and on, he was seeing 60 to 75 people that were being processed systematically as they were tortured to death in 24 intelligence branches in and around Damascus. So what Caesar so bravely documented every single day, having to traverse both revolutionary-held areas and regime-held areas. At any moment, as mentioned, he could have lost his life. Did this and exposed 55,000 pictures, well over 11,000 individuals that were tortured to death. And only when things became really dangerous did Caesar and the rest of the team decide that it's time to go, in which case he escaped the country and now resides in Europe in a safe place with his immediate family. What Caesar brought out was very significant. For him, he wasn't looking at at legal issues or transitional justice or the bigger pictures. He simply wanted to make sure that family members, and many Syrians have family members in Assad jails, we're not living on false hope. We're not sending bribes and paying money that are going to the torturers when their children or siblings or brothers and sisters were already dead. And so that was really his driver. But after he came out, he felt a responsibility in the rest of the team to make the world aware of what's happening and to pursue accountability. And so he went to the United States where he spoke at a hearing of the House Foreign Affairs Committee in the United States Congress. He went to the White House. He spoke at the U.S. National Memorial Holocaust Museum, thinking that this is enough. He's going to show the world what the Syrians already knew. He's going to show the world that we are living another never again moment, and that this is going to, end up becoming something that's outrageous to everyone, and people will act. He really believed that, and it's disappointing to this day. If you ask him, what was sort of, his biggest disappointment is the fact that after all of that, nothing happened, especially, while he was in the U.S. where he thought more could be done. And finally, we've taken this exhibit to different places in different parliaments and so on. And what we find all the time is outrage, but unfortunately very little to no action. And I think, it's horrible to be able to live through this and know that this is ongoing, yet do very little about it. This is a snapshot in time and in geography. This is only Damascus. This is only 2011 to 2013. this continues. The documentation of these horrendous crimes continues, which shows that the regime feels that there is no consequence or accountability to him or the heads of these different intelligence branches that are committing these crimes every single day. And so we continue to work on identifying each of these individual victims, and with the help of Ambassador Rapp, who both when he was in the US government and now has sacrificed and dedicated so much time to leading the legal efforts for accountability and justice when it comes to this. And hopefully we will get to a day where prosecutions can start for these criminals. But more importantly, and I'll leave you with this, one thing that Caesar said during his meeting at the White House was that, you know, the thousands of people that he took pictures of are dead, and we can't get them back. But there are hundreds of thousands of people that remain in Assad jails, and we must do everything we can to ensure that their fate is not the fate of these pictures and the individuals and victims that you see in these pictures around you. Thanks.
Thank you, Maz. Okay, Barry Andrews.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you very much for agreeing to chair today. The goal is very proud to be associated with this exhibition today. We've been working in Syria since 2012, and it has now become the largest operation in our history. And so we have to testify, we bear witness, we see what we see every day, and part of that duty is to continue our advocacy work and to host exhibitions such as this. So we're delighted to be associated with this today. What I'm going to talk about in the time allotted to me is really the Irish perspective on some of this, because I'm surrounded by greater experts on Syria and the larger legal issues and political issues. There's something about Ireland's humanitarian tradition which most of you in this room will be very familiar with. And I often quote Daniel O'Connell in this regard. Daniel O'Connell was the great liberator of Ireland in the early part of the 19th century. Daniel O'Connell's opposition to slavery, his support for women's rights, and his central belief in the common brotherhood of man shaped his worldview and in turn played a part in the evolution of Ireland's international outlook today, including non-alignment, peace building, and humanitarianism. His reading of the modern human rights agenda would have been outward-looking, progressive, and provoking. However, I believe he would have despaired at the failure of the international system to have evolved sufficiently to protect populations in conflict and to prevent continuing and horrific human rights abuses. O'Connell's view of the world was best described in a comment by Frederick Douglass, who was the great former slave American campaigner and activist who came to Ireland in 1845. On the passing of Daniel O'Connell, Frederick Douglass said, O'Connell was succeeded, he regretted to say, by the Duffys, the Mitchells, the Marrs, and others, men who loved liberty for themselves and their country, but were utterly destitute of sympathy with the cause of liberty in countries other than their own. Douglass and O'Connell were kindred in many ways, and Douglass, writing to William Lloyd Harrison in 1846 of his impressions of the Irish famine, he said, "Though I am more closely connected and identified with one class of outraged, oppressed, and enslaved people, I cannot allow myself to be insensible to the wrongs and sufferings of any part of the great family of man. I am not only an American slave, but a man, and as such I am bound to use my powers for the welfare of the whole human brotherhood." In the words of O'Connell himself, on the occasion of Douglass's visit here to Dublin in 1845, O'Connell said, "I am the friend of liberty in every clime, class, and colour. My sympathy with distress is not confined within the narrow bounds of my own green island." So the evidence of that imperative is to be found many, many times on this island in the intervening period. But this powerful political tradition in Ireland is constantly tested and requires to be earned afresh with every generation. Now our generation is engaged in its test, and this requires us to adhere to basic principles of solidarity, of multilateralism, and support for our neighbours wherever they may be. Jean-Claude Juncker earlier this week said that the EU itself could fail if the crisis around refugees and migrants is not solved, which is a staggering statement from the President of the European Commission. Can the very existence of the EU really be under threat? People say we don't have a means to accommodate the influx and that in any case they're all terrorists or they're criminals. Countries are putting up barriers to protect themselves from the influx. Effectively, the EU is paying Turkey to keep Syrians there while doing nothing to stop Syrians from fleeing that country. So let's put all of this in some kind of perspective. As I wrote recently in the Irish Times, if I told you that the population of the EU had increased in 2015 by 0.2%, you would probably think that that was a bit low and a strong indicator of the difficult demographic problems that lie ahead for our aging population. But more than 1 million refugees and migrants arrived in Europe in 2015. That is 0.2% of the population of the EU. Notwithstanding this, the EU finds itself unable to cope. Fundamental freedoms, Schengen, and all the principles of solidarity are under pressure because of what Peter Sutherland referred to as ruinously selfish behaviour. Angela Merkel's policies can only succeed if her generosity is matched by other member states. Here in Ireland, 150,000 migrants came into this country in 2007 alone. A net migration into this country of over 100,000. That happened continuously for many years. Almost 500,000 people that came into this country. We coped well with that number, and significant numbers in the years around 2007. So it is incredible to hear Irish politicians say that we should bear in mind that there are still people on housing lists and we should do nothing until we have addressed everything on the social agenda here in Ireland. It's also worth bearing in mind that the increase in population is made up of young people who are ready and wish to work and will not be any strain on the state in terms of education or health systems. We should honestly look at the issue of terrorism. A guy asked me on local radio if I was afraid to travel to Paris or London or Frankfurt after the recent terrorist attacks. I made the point that the current EU member states lost 20 million people in the 6 years of World War II. Less than 500 people have died in terrorist attacks in the EU in the last 20 years. What terrorists want is people to be terrified. They want us to be so terrified that we fall into noisy argument, we build razor wire fences and fear people who are different to us. What I fear is that the one lasting monument to those 20 million dead, the European Union, the great tribute to peace and reconciliation on the continent of Europe, will be fatally weakened by terrorism. So we must remain vigilant, but not lose perspective. And we should remember that the sacrifice of so many that built it up is being threatened by so few that it's destroying it. There are a few things that this country can do to help. Firstly, and this has happened, we can provide financial support. The Government of Ireland has provided over €42 million in aid in the last 5 years, and unlike many other countries, exceeded its 2015 pledge. The Irish government has called on the UN to refer the conflict to the International Criminal Court. Secondly, we can take advantage of the traditions and history, which is very contemporary in terms of conflict on this island. There has been a tremendous amount of learning around such issues as confidence-building measures, conflict sensitivity, and the political economy of reconciliation. As a non-belligerent in the Western coalition involved in the military activity in Syria, we have both credibility and authority. Thirdly, the Irish government should be calling for an international summit on migration and refugees, fed into by citizens' forums where issues around integration and diversity can be addressed. And I want to finish by referring to a quote from Edmund Burke, who is a member of the UK Parliament, born here in Dublin. He said, "No greater mistake was made than to do nothing because you can't do everything." And we in Gold feel we can't do everything, but we certainly aren't going to do nothing. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Okay, now Ambassador Stephen Rapp. Ambassador.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's great to be joining you today, and I certainly echo what the last two speakers have said. The pictures on the wall, these photographs, certainly cry out for justice. As a person who's spent most of his life prosecuting, one imagines the individuals that ordered these crimes, that sent men, women, and children into a situation where they'd be burned by chemicals, eviscerated, cut and hacked, and eyes gouged out, and starved, and made to suffer the most excruciating horror and pain that a human can imagine. And as it happens to them, witness it happening to others. Justice is absolutely essential for these kind of crimes. I will say from my own experience at the international level, and I worked for 6 years at the Rwanda Tribunal as a senior prosecutor and then as chief of prosecutions, prosecuting, leading the cases against individuals responsible for the genocide in Rwanda, the murder of 800,000 over the period of 100 days. and later went to West Africa as the chief prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone and tried those responsible for amputation and sexual slavery and murder, and eventually charged and brought to trial a president of a country, Charles Taylor, in a trial presided over by a great judge from this island, Teresa Doherty. And as you may know, Taylor was convicted of 11 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and is today serving a 50-year sentence. That the evidence in those cases was not as strong as the evidence in this one. This is even stronger than the evidence against the Nazis at Nuremberg. The Nazis did not take pictures of their victims with cards on their victims identifying them by name and by facility, and have people like Caesar put them into computers with actually the date and time in which those fresh dead bodies arrived. This is the clearest evidence that I've ever seen of the implications of the highest level of regime. And we've got different facilities, 215, a major facility of the intelligence services of Syria, another one, Jawiyah, Air Force Intelligence, right next to this hospital, 601. You can read each of these facilities, and you can talk to Syrians who've, well, at one time or another have been there and who managed somehow through bribery or occasionally by finding a judge with goodwill to survive. And these are institutions in which people are in prison today. And some of these people certainly were fighting the regime. Of course, no one was fighting the regime violently in March of 2011 when students were protesting, but eventually facing a regime that reacted not at all, that said that any kind of protest was treason and sedition, you had an armed conflict. So maybe some of these are fighting. But I've talked to the parents of some of these victims, and I talked to one from Daraa, who was actually still in Syria in 2013, and he was in a construction business, and his son was bringing supplies to a work site, and because he was from Daraa, which was where the revolution began, he ends up in prison, starved and tortured to death. This is but just some of the documentation, and certainly the strongest that has come out of Syria. But you have a regime that has almost maniacal desire to document what it does, and for people within it to sort of cover their backsides by doing that. More than 800,000 pages of written documents have come out. Orders to send some of these very people out of places like Deir ez-Zor or Raqqa, areas now under the control of ISIS, but then under the control of the regime, into these prisons. And there are groups supported by the international community that are documenting this to the day when justice will be possible. Of course, people say, why not justice now? And certainly the victims and the survivors and the families that I meet say, why not justice now? And it's not for lack of trying. We heard that Ireland, together with a great many members of the United Nations, urged the Security Council to refer the situation to the ICC. That received 13 votes, including the vote of my country, the United States, but there were 2 vetoes from Russia and China, so that hasn't occurred. And other approaches, like the approach that Judge Doherty and I worked on of a hybrid court, that required the country itself, after the conflict, to ask the international community to come in and form a mixed court with it. This regime is not asking anybody to come in and establish justice. Indeed, it's opposed to justice. But the strength of this evidence, I think, increases the chance and increases the opportunity, if we all push, for that day of justice to arrive and for any kind of peace process. And of course we want peace. Of course we want this conflict to end. But the idea that the children, the brothers, the sisters, the mothers, the sons are going to sit down and make a deal with those who have committed such horrible murder without the possibility of account, without accountability, in a fair basis, with all of the communities involved, recognizing that particularly now in the conflict and with the crimes of ISIS, there are crimes on all sides. Without fair justice, if you don't have that, the chance of putting together a Syrian society in the future is impossible. I will say that the chances of justice internationally and in Syria are not strong today, but the day of justice will arrive when justice can happen there. But short of that, as I've been working with Syrians and with those that have documented this thing, and as European countries have seen the impact of these crimes, that the ability of and the will of prosecutors to take on cases on which there's jurisdiction that involve Syrian crimes is greater today than it's ever been. Understand that the crime of torture, under the Torture Convention, which almost every country in the world ratified, including Syria, the Torture Convention of 1983, is a crime like piracy. It's a crime of universal jurisdiction. It's a crime against all of humankind. Any country, if they follow the exact words of the Torture Convention, some countries' statutes do, some don't, can prosecute torture anywhere in the world, whether they have the perpetrator in their country or a victim in their country. Now, frankly, we want countries that have a connection to these crimes prosecuting them. But with hundreds of thousands of Syrians leaving because their son can't even deliver the goods, in which life is impossible, then the possibility that we can begin to actually prosecute in national systems the commandant of Unit 216 or Jawiya, the Air Force Intelligence, et cetera, and to the extent that the perpetrators have come out, and a few have, that we can begin to have prosecutions and send the signal that there will be justice for these cases. But thank you all for being here, and look forward to doing anything that we can, everything that we can together to achieve accountability and to send the signal that these people didn't die in vain. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And now Vicki Aiken, who is Gold's Country Director in Syria.
I'd like to start by sharing a story about what happened to the brother of one of my staff. He was taken by the regime and held for a very long time, and his family wasn't told where he was or why he was taken. And finally, they were told he was dead, and they had seen his body, and this was in 2006. So this did not start with the war. And 3 months after he died, after he was killed, the family was told they could come and collect the body. But they couldn't use, they had to collect it themselves. They weren't allowed any outside assistance, so they had to take this dead, decomposed body in their own car and drive 3 hours to their home to bury him. This is part of the reason why the revolution started, because of behavior like this. But one thing that I'd like to say is that what happens in the prisons is horrific, but it's not the only crime against humanity that's happening in Syria. This is my 3rd year there, and I keep saying to myself, it can't get worse. This is as bad as it's going to get. But every time I've been proved wrong. Earlier last year, the opposition forces had taken over an area called Idlib, which is where Gol primarily operates. And in retaliation for taking over that area, the government, instead of just fighting against the forces that took it over, retaliated by bombing civilian targets, markets, hospitals, schools. We lost 2 of our own staff in bombings on markets. And each month, we saw that it's the highest rate of civilian deaths since the beginning of the conflict. And it just kept increasing month after month. October of last year, the Russians joined in the bombing under the auspices of targeting ISIS. Yet the majority of the bombing that has been going on is in non-ISIS held areas, and the majority of the bombing that's been going on is against civilian targets. Again, schools, markets. The pictures that you see on these walls, we see these pictures nearly every day from our staff, that this is what they have to see. This is what they experience. nearly every single person on our staff has had a family member killed or tortured or imprisoned. December of this year, you'll see the media attention on a place called Madaya, just one of the many besieged areas within Syria where food is not allowed in. The pictures that you see are pictures like this. People are literally dying of starvation. The area around the towns are mined, and there are snipers set up, so if you try to escape that, you're shot or you're killed. That's a crime against humanity. And that Madaya happened to make the news, but there are hundreds of thousands of people in other areas of Syria that are besieged by the government, by the opposition forces, by ISIS. And very little is being done to help them. And in fact, Madaya was not considered a besieged area because at one point in October of last year, a shipment of aid had gotten in, but people were still dying of starvation. So we just need to, look at what's happening, ask ourselves, you see in the media, why are people leaving Syria? This is why people are leaving Syria. If this was happening to your family, if you had children that you wanted to raise, wouldn't you leave? If this is what you lived with day after day. Sorry, I'm going to keep mine short so we can get to any questions that you have. But please, look at what's happening.
Thank you, Vicki. Moaz, if I could just start with you. President Assad has been asked about these images, and he's been asked about Caesar, and he said, who is this man? Who is Caesar? Where is the verification? Who is to say that these images... no, he said a lot more than that. I'm summarizing. But who is to say these images are Syria? Where is the verification? Yeah. Your response to all of that?
Sure. He also said that this was all done in a studio somewhere and made up, and another conspiracy theory against his resistance against imperialism of the West and all of that good stuff. And, as far as the pictures, just to go through, one of the first things that we did was take these pictures and leave them in all the original copies of the evidence and leave them in the custody of a third-party country in Europe that's neutral to the conflict, for them to do their own verification, but also for them to be able to give these pictures to any courts and prosecutions or police forces, et cetera, that might be interested in pursuing a legal case. But quickly after that, with the help of Ambassador Rapp, we signed a memorandum of understanding with the US government to be able to take these photographs and give them to one of the best sort of investigative units in the world, to the FBI, to have them verify these pictures and their authenticity and so on. So we did that, and the FBI report did come out authenticating that there are no artifacts or any sort of editing of these photos, that these represent real people, real events in real places. But outside of that, we have already identified, and we continue to do that every single day, 731 of these victims. We are in touch with their families. We work every day with family members as they recognize their loved ones. We've cropped the pictures to the faces of the least sort of graphic, mutilated pictures and put them out there so people can verify their loved ones. And all of these people, many of these people have been identified by their families. For example, this lady that you see right there is a pharmacy student from Deir Zor, who was in Damascus, and her crime was that she was providing humanitarian aid to the internally displaced in Damascus. Many people were flooding the constant bombardment of the besieged areas, and they were living in these parks and so on. So she was providing medical aid and milk and support. And by the way, the crime of being caught with baby formula or these things is a much worse crime than being even caught with AK-47s or something else. And this is just the matter of fact of how this regime operates. So it's beyond any doubt. These pictures are all real, and this is what happens by the Assad regime. One final point on that. You see some of these photos where there's quite a few people. It's just a single day's murders for Assad's regime. There's another one back there. That garage is out in the open, and it's in Mezzeh, and anyone familiar with Damascus understands that Mezzeh is very close to the presidential palace, which lies on a mountain. So there's a clear line of sight. If the dictator was to walk to his window of less than a kilometer, where he would see this regular systematic machinery of death where these people are processed every day, bagged up, and then shipped out. So according to law enforcement agencies, according to the family members of these individuals, everyone knows that these are 100% verified pictures of real people tortured to death by the Assad regime.
Ambassador Rapp, on your point about this is evidence, and evidence for the future and for justice to be served, and it's a point well made, but what Vicki and what Muaz have told us is that hundreds of thousands of others are in danger. And if I was Caesar and the people who collaborated with him after this 2 years, and then picking a point where it got too dangerous to continue, and now the world knows, and then what? Then nothing would be what I was thinking. So I get your point about future justice, but what about people who were in peril after these images and who died after these images were shown to the world?
No, and there's no question that this is enormously frustrating and disappointing, and it's in the nature, of course, of our international system that sometimes you can develop the global consensus to act and to establish a tribunal like we did for Rwanda or eventually for the former Yugoslavia. In this situation, it has not been possible because you've got, frankly, the strong support of Russia and Iran for this regime, and Russia actually coming in and now actively bombing not ISIS but civilian areas and being involved in bombing the crossroads where food transports occur and contributing to the starvation of people in these villages. So. Unless one's prepared to take it into a conflict, which my government, for instance, is not, in terms of going to war with this regime and running the risk that could actually add to the problem. At the moment, the best thing that we can do is to continue to make sure that people don't die with the secret that this is happening, and that we expose what's occurring everywhere and in every way to lay the foundation for justice in the future, and if we've got jurisdiction anywhere for justice at present. And we recognize that when it's come to other horrors where the world is eventually awakened, when it came to the Nazis, we couldn't stop Auschwitz, Birkenau, mass killings in Treblinka and Sobibor, and the other crimes against prisoners and slaves that cost the lives of tens of millions until the conflict was done and we had justice. But I think we have to focus on making sure that we have the strong evidence. I mean, I've also been involved in prosecuting, some of the Rwandan genocide cases. There were acquittals of individuals that many people thought were guilty. Of course, thinking and proving are two different things. But by really putting this together today, I think we will have justice. And it's hard for people in Syria that have watched and experienced this over 5 years to believe that. But I believe it, and I know because of what we've done elsewhere that day will arrive.
Vicki, Muaz made the point that this is a snapshot, a pretty big snapshot, 11,000 individuals, but in terms of geographically, it's where one person could work, where one person was stationed, and it's also a relatively short period of time, over 2 years. The point at which Caesar exited, the late summer of 2013, a new never again moment was crossed with the use of chemical weapons. President Obama called for Assad to go immediately. The world was outraged, and then paralysis once again at the top levels. So what was life in Syria like after that moment? Was that a before and after moment, or is that an outsider looking in?
I think the fact that they crossed that line and then nothing, it turned out not to actually be a red line, I think that is the point where a lot of Syrians lost hope that that someone would come in and actually do something. After that line was crossed, there was chlorine attacks on cities. You saw videos of children being killed by chlorine, and there was an investigation into that as well. And that was just yet another incident of horrors upon the Syrian people that couldn't be stopped. And so I think that was a point when hope started to decline.
And people started to flee, refugees.
Exactly.
Ambassador?
Yeah, I do want to add to that, and this is a small consolation, but and I see how the hope was diminished, and I also see, frankly, the most Syrians that I know wish the United States, wish Britain and other countries would have gone in and bombed. Even if it would have killed a few innocent people, it would have sent a rather clear signal, and I hear that from the people that would have been perhaps on the receiving end. Now, I know that was quite a controversial thing in Europe, taking that particular step. And when the President of the United States said he'd go to Congress, and Congress wasn't prompt to approve it, they went with the approach of removing the most serious chemical weapons, and then we continue to have the chlorine gas. I will note that that's one area where there's been a small crack on the accountability front. We've had the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons that has done investigations. They're limited. They can't point fingers at who's responsible. But if you read their reports, it's pretty clear who is. I mean, nobody else has aerial equipment to drop these things other than the regime. But now with the UN finally, I mean, we just continue to fight this cause in the Security Council. We now have a joint investigative mission that can, at the end of the day, point fingers and make recommendations on accountability. Don't hold your breath in terms of then somebody actually voting to send it somewhere. But it is not for lack of trying and beating at this particular effort, and I think we will have the roadmap on the evidence on chemical weapons, though frankly, from day one and seeing the 1,300 killed in El Ghouta, there was really no question who was responsible. But that evidence will be there and will be adopted internationally.
I'm going to come back to Barry, but you just want to make a point on that?
Just to make a quick point. First of all, that wasn't the first sarin attack. There were hundreds of other attacks, just not enough scale to get as much media. And it was, as mentioned, a very place where people sort of lost hope because people really thought something would happen. But afterwards, it became clear to the Assad regime that he can act with impunity. It became easier for him to continue to document what he's doing, knowing that even chemical weapons, such a horrendous form, not to say that the conventional weapons aren't killing even more people, and the barrel bombs became a norm going forward. And to speak about the UN, even when there was a Chapter 7 UN Security Council resolution on the use of chemical weapons with chlorine, adopted and voted on even by the Russians, he bombed with chlorine and barrel bombs that next day, and zero happened. And this is when we had a Chapter 7 resolution of the Security Council. It's unbelievable the way that the world has deserted the Syrian people when it comes to any of these horrendous crimes. Just wanted to add that.
Barry, I suppose Vicki brought us to a point where where people may have decided that it's safer to put my child in a boat than to stay in our homeland. And that was a direct quote of a woman I spoke to in a refugee camp between Serbia and Macedonia last month. I was in Serbia and Croatia, and Europe's response and the swinging door response of a horrific image of a dead child, of a drowned child, public sympathy, versus the horrific crimes of Cologne at New Year, and then public outrage, and the fact that refugees are getting the blame for this entire swing, and just the schizophrenia of Europe over the last 6 or 8 months. Just you had, I suppose, a message to any Irish politicians who talk about hordes. The Irish Times told us today 20 refugees have sought to come to Ireland.
Well, I tried to make that point in my opening comments, Chris, that we need to have a sense of proportion. We need to understand the facts. There are innumerable myths about the nature of the population movements that are going on, about our capacity to cope, and the supposed threat to our security. This is all looked at through a security lens rather than a humanitarian lens. So I think we really have to confront the facts, and the facts are that we have coped with population movements before of a much lesser nature. We have extrapolated that because Cologne happened, this is related to Syria, whereas we know that Many of the perpetrators of those crimes were from North Africa, and they have nothing whatsoever to do with the conflict that we're talking about here this evening. There are certainly issues that need to be addressed in relation to integration, but to try and conflate them with the refugee issue is a very lazy and frankly useless exercise, but it has gained enormous political energy through populism and pushing certain buttons in the political situation. So we just have to continually confront that with the facts. And if I just make one comment in relation to the previous discussion you were having on the Security Council resolutions and the turning point that was August 2013, which is the date at which Caesar comes to an end. That was the time of the chemical weapons attacks when the red line was crossed and no consequences flowed from it. And did hope abandon? Yes, of course it did, and radicalization deepened, and we became familiar then with the refugee movements. We became familiar with ISIS after that period of time. So radicalization came. So the point about this, I think, when you're looking at these photographs, is to remember that it's a pre-ISIS, pre-refugee crisis snapshot, when this was already the worst humanitarian catastrophe in terms of population movements since World War II. So it's important to understand where that is. So even if you do solve the refugee crisis tomorrow by some fiat, I don't know, and if ISIS disappears, you go back to this issue, which is the governance of Syria and the disaster that flowed from it. It takes you back to this exact moment here. And finally, on the Project for the Responsibility to Protect has done a study which demonstrates that with each passing UN Security Council resolution that is not enforced, that is discussed and not passed, violence in Syria increases directly after each Security Council resolution. So in other words, the Assad regime is emboldened by the failure. So even if the UN were guided by the principle, do no harm, they would press no resolutions whatsoever.